Good morning, everyone. Please start to take your seats. We're going to get started in a sec. Ready? All righty. Claudia, good to go? All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Canadian Internet Governance Forum. We are really honored to be back here in person with you for the first time since 2019. Nous sommes très honorés d'être ici avec vous pour la première fois depuis 2019. Before I begin, I would like to note that there is simultaneous interpretation available out in the hallway. Avant de commencer, veuillez noter que vous pouvez suivre les conversations de cette journée via l'interprétation simultanée. Today's event is bilingual, so be sure to grab a headset if you need one. And please return it at the end of the day. Cet événement est bilingue, donc n'hésitez pas à prendre un casque à l'extérieur de la salle et la retourner en fin de journée. Pour m'aimer sur Zoom, appuyez sur le monde et choisissez la langue que vous voulez. My name is Georgia Evans, and in my day job, I help manage the policy and advocacy activities at CIRA. But on this stage, I am the Secretariat of the Canadian Internet Governance Forum. I've been helping out since May 2020, so it really is exciting to be back here in person for me for the first time. Today, we are situated on the traditional unceded Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation territory, a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This land has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous people. We'd like to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which we all now gather. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other people in the Montreal community. Aujourd'hui, nous discuterons de l'avenir que nous voulons. Comme vous saviez, le Forum canadien sur la gouvernance de l'Internet est une initiative nationale du FGI mondial organisée par l'ONU. À la fin de cette semaine, les délégués de notre forum iront à Kyoto, au Japon. In Kyoto, representatives from our CIGF All Hands Committee will deliver the outcomes of today's discussions to represent Canadian priorities on the global stage. We've got a jam-packed agenda today filled with the most pressing issues facing the Canadian internet community, both here at home and abroad. We'd like to extend sincere gratitude to our presenting sponsors, including my organization, CIRA, as well as TikTok Canada. Without the support of these organizations, today's event would not be possible. I would also like to thank our gold sponsors, ICANN and Canary, and the contributions from the Applied AI Institute. I'd also like to extend a sincere thanks to the Canadian IGF All Hands Committee. You can find the list of committee members at canadianigf.ca/about-us. So, what else do you need to know about today? Nous avons un ordre de jour bien rempli que vous pouvez accéder par scanner le code QR sur votre badge. Nous aurons quelques pauses dans lesquelles vous pouvez stretch your legs, grab a snack, and chat with each other. And of course, please stick around to join us for the cocktail hour at the end of the day. For those of you who are virtually participating, or for those of you who will inevitably bring out your phones, hopefully only during the break, feel free to keep the conversation going on social media with the hashtag CIGF 2023, ou car c'est un événement bilingue, vous pouvez utiliser le mot-clic FCGI 2023. We're on the platform formerly known as Twitter at @CanadianIGF, as well as on Facebook at that same handle, and on LinkedIn at Canadian Internet Governance Forum. Thank you again. Please make the best of the day, ask questions, make connections, and let's help shape the future that we want. And now I will turn it to my colleague, Adam Eisner, the General Manager of Registry Services at CIRA, to introduce our first keynote. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Good morning. It's great to have everybody here for the first in-person Canadian Internet Governance Forum since 2019. My name is Adam Eisner. I'm the General Manager of Registry Services at CIRA. And for those of you who may not be familiar with CIRA or the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, we're the folks responsible and behind over 3.3 million .ca domain names. We work every day to build a trusted internet for Canadians, and we're proud to be a sponsor of this year's CIGF as part of our Net Good program to reinvest in Canada's internet. So it's no secret that the internet is at a crossroads. From growing calls for regulation to new technologies like generative AI, to the slow decline of platforms like Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, it feels like the internet is really starting to experience some growing pains. And within all of this change, many organizations are working hard to steward this network of networks constructively to prevent what's called, the so-called splinter net that many of us have been warning about for years. And lucky for us, one of the leaders of that effort is with us today. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker for the CIGF, ICANN Board Chair, Tripti Sinha. ICANN, or the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, helps ensure a stable, secure, and unified global internet. Actually, ICANN celebrated its 25th anniversary just last month and has truly, really been instrumental over that time in ensuring that the internet remains both reliable and global through collaborative efforts that involve both technical and policy-based work. Tripti took on the role of ICANN board chair back in October 2022, and with over 3 decades of progressive experience in internet and cyber infrastructure technologies, Tripti is a true leader and visionary in the global internet community, and we're delighted to have her with us today. So I'll turn it over to Tripti now, and I'll ask for your help in welcoming her to the stage. Yeah, come on.
Thank you, Adam. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, Montreal. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the organizers of the Canadian IGF for inviting me here today in this beautiful country. It is an honor to be here alongside such distinguished guests as Termorshuizen, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and many others. I am thrilled to be part of the important discussions that will happen during this IGF. Canada is a perfect example of a society that is richly multicultural, multilingual, global, and has a key role to play in shaping the future of the internet. Your country has already played an important role in influencing it. With a commitment to a free, open, interoperable, and inclusive internet, Canada has been a strong advocate for multi-stakeholder governance. Today, internet governance is at a crossroads, and it is imperative that we address the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead as we work to create the future we want. The creation of the internet is one of the most transformative events in human history. In just a few decades, the internet has revolutionized how we communicate, conduct business, access information, and connect with the world. In Canada, the internet has been essential in creating a knowledge-based economy, driving innovation, and connecting Canadians from coast to coast. Recent global events, from the COVID-19 pandemic to ongoing conflicts, have shown us just how vital the internet is in our modern age. Indeed, to state the obvious, the internet has become the lifeblood of our global society. It connects us, empowers us, and transcends geographical boundaries. In essence, the internet is a critical resource, and access to it is a fundamental human right. However, this immense technological transformation has also brought about new challenges, including questions about how to continue the multi-stakeholder processes of maintaining and coordinating this vast network of networks as the internet expands, as technology evolves, and as the treatment of data matures. Founded in 1998 as a nonprofit organization, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, is the global consensus-based entity responsible for the coordination of the technical management of the Internet's unique identifier systems. Indeed, as was just mentioned, we celebrate our 25th anniversary this year. Specifically, ICANN coordinates the allocation and assignment of names in the root zone of the domain name system, the DNS, and coordinates the development and implementation of policies, the allocation and assignment at the topmost level of Internet protocol numbers and autonomous system numbers, the assignment of protocol parameters, and facilitates the coordination of the operation and evolution of the DNS root name server system. In simpler terms, our mission is to ensure the stable and secure operation of the Internet's unique identifier systems so that the Internet remains functional and accessible to everyone. ICANN is not involved in governing the content, services, or applications available on the Internet. ICANN also coordinates global policy development for these unique identifiers. ICANN policies are developed by a multi-stakeholder community, a rich fabric of representatives from the private sector, governments, the technical community, civil society, and even individual Internet users. ICANN's public meetings are open to anyone to attend and participate in person or remotely. Together, this community is committed to serving the best interests of the public, not only the billions of users online today, but also those who are yet to connect. As we create the future we want, we are confronted with challenges that we will overcome together. Here are some of these challenges. Let us talk about the Internet's unified namespace. Today, nearly every device that is connected to the Internet runs on the same set of protocols and standards and uses the same identifier systems. By using this shared voluntary system, devices can communicate with each other. The DNS is the currently prevailing naming system of the Internet, where ICANN holds a coordination role. When you type a domain name into your browser, you naturally expect to easily navigate to the website you're looking for, and you can rely on this because of the DNS. The Internet has long served as fertile ground for innovation and experimentation. That even includes the DNS. The protocol has evolved over time and continues to evolve. Sometimes the changes are major, such as when the DNS security extensions were added to the protocol to provide strong authentication of DNS data. That significant addition to the DNS led to corresponding evolution at ICANN as well. We were entrusted to manage the critically important master cryptographic key for these security extensions. Recent innovation on the Internet has also included the rise of identifier systems not based on the DNS. These alternative naming systems are often based on blockchains, another relatively recent technology. ICANN does not coordinate these identifier systems, but we have endeavored to understand these systems and be welcoming to their communities. For example, sessions on emerging identifiers have been held at several recent ICANN public meetings. These sessions allow the ICANN community to learn about these technologies and for their developers to be introduced to the ICANN community and see how multi-stakeholder governance works. We believe it is important to have mutual understanding. Alternative naming systems do not necessarily coexist seamlessly with the DNS. Their use can cause ambiguity, such as when the same name is present in the DNS and in another naming system. This name collision situation can cause unpredictable behavior and confusion for Internet users. Because the DNS is a prevailing identifier system on the Internet, domain names work the same way everywhere on the Internet. A single unified namespace is tremendously valuable and has contributed to the Internet's ubiquity. A loss of that unified namespace would lead to a situation called Internet fragmentation and make the Internet more difficult to use for everyone. ICANN recognizes that the Internet and its protocols have not been static. They have changed with advances in technology and to meet changing needs. As the Internet's identifier systems continue to evolve, ICANN will work with our community to continue to promote a unified and reliable Internet within a sound framework of global multi-stakeholder governance. Now, let us talk about regulation and legislation. There are legitimate concerns of online crimes of all natures, from disinformation to illegal trafficking and everything in between, that need to be addressed. These problems exist in the content and application layer of the internet. It is critical that when addressing these issues, that the focus is not incorrectly placed on the technical aspects of the internet, with the collateral outcome of not addressing the root causes of these crimes and finding solutions to mitigate them. We must also navigate the unintended effects that well-intentioned regulation and legislation may have on interoperability. We need to ensure that the fundamentals of the internet's infrastructure are not compromised. The internet was created as a decentralized, unbiased, and accessible tool. If the unique identifiers, particularly domain names, stop working the same way everywhere, there is the potential that the internet will be fragmented. We must collectively ensure that this vital global resource is managed and preserved as a common good infrastructure for the world. ICANN takes seriously its responsibility to inform and collaborate with public policy makers to ensure that their efforts to protect their communities do not unintentionally impair the internet's functionality. Furthermore, governments and intergovernmental organizations are encouraged to participate in ICANN's multi-stakeholder policy development. Our government's advisory committee, the GAC, which advises the ICANN board on matters at the intersection of ICANN policies and public policy, currently has 182 countries and territories as members, as well as 38 GAC observers. The technical underpinnings of the internet know no political or geographic boundaries. Keeping the internet running is a worldwide effort involving thousands of people with a shared goal: to connect. This effort involving participants from civil society, academia, governments, the private sector, the technical community, and many others is multi-stakeholder governance. Together, we work to ensure a secure, stable, and resilient global internet. Now let me comment on new technologies and our evolving digital experience. The past year has been marked by great innovations in technology that are bound to enhance the internet. We are now at a pivotal point in time with breakthrough developments in artificial intelligence, or AI, and advances in quantum technology and communications ready to transform or even redefine our digital experience. The potential of AI cannot be denied. We have yet to fully understand how this will shape and influence our lives. But one thing is clear: it will be globally impactful. Quantum technologies are similarly poised on the brink of innovation. These new technologies serve as undeniable agencies of change, whose outcomes and impact will rely on and be delivered by the power of interconnected networks, the internet. And yet another challenge is closing the digital divide. Our priority and the future that we want is one of digital inclusivity. A future where anyone, regardless of location, language, socioeconomic level, or culture, can use the internet. The world has seen emerging economies flourish, education levels rise, and nations grow because of access to this global resource. Despite the internet's ubiquity, in many parts of the world, significant portions of the global population remain unconnected. A lack of access to the internet impacts access to education, services, healthcare, and economic opportunity. Expanding access to the internet is not just a matter of developing the infrastructure. It requires addressing affordability, digital literacy, and the creation of locally relevant content and services. Governments, the private sector, and civil society must collaborate to ensure that every citizen, regardless of their location or native language, can reap the benefits of this digital age. A challenge we face is creating a more multilingual, inclusive internet. For the internet to be considered truly global, the foundational infrastructure must accept all languages and scripts. The majority of the more than 1,200 generic top-level domains today are in Latin script-based languages. Many current internet users and most of the next few billions of users coming online are part of communities that speak and write in languages with non-Latin scripts. We must continue to address this imbalance of catering to only a few languages. The ICANN community is spearheading several new projects with the goal of better adapting the internet to the diverse languages and cultures of the world. The power of the internet comes from being a single interoperable internet that is easily accessible globally and locally. True interoperability cannot be achieved without both global and local access. This, in turn, implies making the internet multilingual for the world's multilingual population. ICANN is supporting this effort via universal acceptance, or UA, described as ensuring that all domain names, including top-level domains TLDs, internationalized domain names IDNs, and email addresses are treated equally and can be used by all internet-enabled applications, devices, and systems. UA provides a gateway to onboarding the next few billions of internet users worldwide. While progress has been made in achieving operational readiness for universal acceptance, there is much more work to be done to ensure that all domain names and email addresses, regardless of length or script, can be accepted, validated, processed, stored, and displayed equally and consistently and correctly. As many of the stakeholders involved are external to ICANN, we are working hard to engage them and motivate them to support UA. Earlier this year, ICANN held the inaugural UA Day in New Delhi, India, to raise awareness and facilitated successful UA Day events around the world, including right here in Montreal. The next wave of new domains will provide users with the opportunity to create a space on the internet for their communities, businesses, and interests in their native and local languages. The internet will continue to evolve to be multilingual and inclusive, achieving a goal in closing the digital divide. Before I conclude my remarks, I must speak about a model that has successfully upheld the technical coordination and technical governance of the underpinnings of the internet, the multi-stakeholder governance model. When governing a fabric of technical infrastructure that spans the globe and whose impact is worldwide, the multi-stakeholder model has proven to be highly successful. A model that enables stakeholders from multiple sectors to come together in dialogue, to share viewpoints, and drive towards consensus-based decision-making. This approach of broad inclusivity and democratization of stakeholder participation has yielded a system of voluntary standards, best practices, cooperation, and trust. Our approach of multi-stakeholder governance, driven by collaboration and shared responsibility, supports a unified global internet for us all. It has produced a working internet for 40 years and with exponential growth in traffic and the number of end users. It has served as a platform of innovation that has changed the world in the most remarkable of ways. The multi-stakeholder model has allowed the internet and the digital economy to flourish while protecting it against unilateral decision-making and control. Starting in 2003, the international community at the Worldwide Summit on the Information Society wisely accepted the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance, recognizing the vital roles of the various stakeholders in maintaining and evolving the internet as a global resource. As the global community comes together again at WSIS Plus 20 in 2 years, let us reaffirm the wisdom and decisions of the past, which are now proven by successful multi-stakeholder stewardship of the internet for over 20 years since the last WSIS affirmation. Let us once again pledge support for the multi-stakeholder model as the most adaptable, inclusive, and effective approach to internet governance. By giving everyone a voice, the internet remains inclusive and trusted. Let it continue to be a platform of service, innovation, and growth spurred by the human mind for the future we want. The internet continues to evolve, and so must we. Canada has been instrumental to the development of the internet and ICANN. In October 1998, Canada hosted the first international ministerial meeting of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on the Digital Economy. It was clear at the time that e-commerce had potential. but it was also clear that rules were needed to aid cooperation. Last year, there were over 27 million e-commerce users in Canada, accounting for 75% of the Canadian population. Statistics Canada estimates that retail e-commerce sales will total $40.3 billion by 2025. Canada has also been a staunch supporter of initiatives to bridge the digital divide. The Universal Broadband Fund is a nearly $3.3 billion Canadian dollar investment to provide high-speed internet access to 98% of Canadians by 2026 and achieve 100% access by 2030. Bold and targeted investments in digital infrastructure as this set an example for other nations to follow. Indeed, Canada's commitment to the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are reflected in these statistics. In particular, SDG 9 and SDG 11 speak to resilient infrastructure and closing the digital divide. These intentional investments are impressive. Canada is home to one of the first country code top-level domains, .ca, and was one of the first members of ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee. In fact, a Canadian woman, Heather Dryden, served as chair of the GAC from 2010 to 2014. The late Bill Graham served on the ICANN board. Kevin Bloomberg, Alan Greenberg, Byron Holland, and Stephanie Perrin continue to work with the Address Supporting Organization, At-Large Community, Country Code Names Supporting Organization, and Generic Names Organization, respectively. Joe Abley, Jacques Latour, and Tara Whalen are all members of the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. Going forward, Canada's leadership in multilateral forums, such as the United Nations and the International Telecommunication Union, will be crucial in advancing global internet governance principles and ensuring that the internet remains accessible to all. The internet has transformed our world. Canada and ICANN are only two of the countless contributors to its development. And as users, you and I share the most important calling to participate in its multi-stakeholder governance. It is our collective responsibility to create the future of the internet, a future that is inclusive, democratic, and driven by global public interest. Together, we can ensure that the internet continues to be an incredible force for good. This future is only possible if we continue to uphold the sound principles of security, stability, resilience, and interoperability in the technical coordination and operation of the internet. I look forward to hearing your ideas on these issues and discussing the challenges and opportunities we share as we work to create the future we want. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Pardon me? All right. Are there any questions? Sorry, I've been asked to put this on. Just give me a second. Yes, go ahead.
Just ask one. You mentioned the word. Thank you. You mentioned the word interoperability probably about a dozen times, right? And the importance of it. Could you, so the importance is clear, could you mention what are the risks of non-interoperability that you see right now? Like you mentioned it as being so important. Is it a given, or is there some risk of that breaking down?
So interoperability actually has, as you know, has led to what we call the open standards that the internet uses to stitch it together. If we were to not interoperate, and typically how do you bring about interoperability is you move towards proprietary standards and protocols. And that has a whole set of other shortcomings, if you will, where there's dominance of a particular technology or player, correct? And they would have a foothold on how this infrastructure would propagate around the world. And also, it would no longer be an innovation platform where there's openness to the point where all these various and sundry different services and technologies have evolved over time. and this fabric of an application-rich internet. So, so that you have the freedom to go develop what you want to do, provided you are able to interoperate, so you have the capability to handshake and connect to the internet. So you would stifle, essentially you would stifle an innovation platform. That would be, if I were to use one word or a few words to describe what would happen, you'd start to stifle innovation. Oh, sorry, I should put this on for the question. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
One of the most interesting things about ICANN is, of course, its internationalism. Despite being an American sort of founded corporation, you've mentioned the deep commitment to an international multi-stakeholder approach. And that's so interesting in the modern age, where you have threats to that internationalism coming from both nations with authoritarian backgrounds, but also with nations that are looking towards securitizing their internet, whether you're talking about breaking cryptography or other matters that are important to interoperability. Can you speak a little bit upon the threats to coming from non-authoritarian nations when it comes to that internationalism? So,
yes, ICANN is a U.S.-based or entity, but it is it's a public benefit corporation incorporated in the United States, but it's an international organization. Just to, it's not U.S. operated, or if you understand the distinction there. So what are the threats from non-authoritarian entities? And I would say, really, the threat comes from regulation and legislation. And as I said earlier, when regulating and legislating, and they're all well-intentioned, should not target the infrastructure where the bits and bytes flow. So, because most of the efforts to control and regulate and legislate activities that need that are at a much higher level in the stack. So when you look at the protocol stack or the stack of the internet, at the top layer where things are happening, that's where we need to put the controls in place. The concern is, don't target the foundational infrastructure where the bits are flowing. So that is one thing that could potentially be a bad side effect of regulation, well-intentioned regulation and legislation. And data, as you know, has matured tremendously over the years. When the internet was first created, and the big topic is who is, and I hesitate to bring that up because it's such a, it inflames emotions. But when it was first created, we were all kind of naive, just building new technologies, and you just wanted to know where your information was coming from, and you typed in who is. It was done purely from an operational perspective, but no one had any sense the internet would become what it has become, and the kind of data that's out there. So our management, our view, our opinion of how data should be managed, and privacy, and all of that has evolved. And we need to address that meaningfully without putting locks in place where it's impossible for things to operate properly. So does that answer your question? That's, yeah. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank
morning.
you for those remarks. This is a rather loaded question for early in the morning, but this is about dialogue. I was just wondering, ICANN's sort of perspective and position on the sort of consumer side of things in a, an environment where we're seeing increased sort of fear and backlash from a consumer perspective around fraud, phishing, ransomware, and use of the internet, where you're seeing, people like my mom are, very skeptical of things online, and that might be sort of driving people off the internet. Does ICANN sort of play a role in that?
So ICANN's remit is very narrow. It's very narrowly focused on just managing the internet's identifier systems. And a lot of other activities that are happening are at a much higher level. So they need to be addressed. No one's denying that. So we are working with those who have contracts to see what role they can play. And the one that comes to mind is DNS abuse, but that's a broad term for a lot of what you just mentioned. is that what active role would they take to ensure the mitigation of these bad behaviors? So it does have a narrow remit. It's highly technically oriented. It's managing the telephone book, if you will, of the internet. That's exactly where we're sort of scoped, and we look at just that aspect. But when it comes to managing things like fraud and so forth, and malware and phishing and all of that, it's at a much, it's at a different level, and you do need security entities and security services to be looking at that. And really, a lot of it is beyond ICANN's remit. Other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tripti. That was a really excellent talk and a great scene setter for the rest of today's conversations. So now we'll transition to our first round of breakout sessions. Breakout session 2, the Canadian presidency of the G7. What should the digital policy priorities be? Will remain in this plenary room. And breakout session 1, Canadian communications policy and internet governance, will take place in the breakout room that is right to the right of this room. It will begin in just under 5 minutes, so please take this time for a quick bio break and find your way to the correct room. And thanks, everybody.
back into the room. We're going to start in the next minute or two. Bonjour tout le monde. On va reconvenir dans quelques instants, donc veuillez prendre place. Let's everyone take a seat, and we'll get started in a minute or two. So it looks like we're all here, settled in. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci pour l'invitation. My name is Paul Samson, president of the Center for International Governance Innovation, known as CIGI, and pleasure to be here today. Let me start by introducing the introductory speaker and the panelists here to kick it off. And it's my pleasure to introduce Cindy Termorshuizen, who is the Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at the Global Affairs Canada, and that is a very big job. And part of the job that she has as well is as the personal representative of the Prime Minister for the G7. And so that's one of the things that she's doing. And it's a big thing because Canada is going to be hosting in 2025, but she's very busy on many other issues, and so we're happy she's here with us today. We have on our panel a very interesting group of individuals, some of whom I know about and some I haven't seen in action yet, so I'm looking forward to that. We have Brenda McPhail, who's Executive Director of the MPP in Digital Policy at McMaster University. And we have Philip Dawson, who's the Head of Policy at Armilla AI. And we have Kyle Matthews, who's Executive Director, the Montreal Institute of Genocide Studies. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have some opening remarks from our G7 leader, and we're going to then, I'm going to offer a couple of little quick remarks. We will turn into a question for all of the panelists, and then we will go to a moderated discussion where I ask each one of the panelists a question. Then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers with the audience, so be ready with some tough questions and some interesting questions. And then we'll do a final round of reflections quickly with all of the panelists. So with that, let me turn over to Cindy for some opening remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here with this panel, and I'm really pleased to be here in person with you. I was just talking with Kyle before the session, and we just remarked how great it is to be able to get back together in person, make connections, and also learn from each other. And my real objective is to learn as much as possible from you today. But I'm here in my G7 capacity, and I want to talk about the link between the G7, digital policy, and particularly about the G7 presidency that Canada will have in 2025. So the G7 has really been a forum of real importance to Canada for almost 50 years. It brings together, as I'm sure all of you know, some of the world's most advanced economies, all bound up by shared values as open and democratic societies. I'm sure you all know the membership, but just to put us all on the same page, the membership of the G7 is Canada, the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And then the European Union has become really a de facto member as well. So it's G7 plus EU. The G7's importance has really grown in the last couple of years. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, it played a very strong coordination and leadership role. And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you saw this massive step up in collaboration and coordination by G7 members. So it's really crystallized its leadership role in the last few years. But it isn't just those issues. If you look at climate change, global health, economic resilience, the G7 really has become the de facto coordinating body for a lot of critical global issues. And digital policy is no exception. It's not going to surprise any of you who think about a lot of these issues every day that digital technologies have become top of mind for G7 leaders, given the incredible potential for advancements in human well-being, but also the not insignificant economic, societal, and security risks that come with evolutions in digital technology. And the G7 has convened digital ministers since 2016 to explore a whole range of issues, including data free flow with trust, foreign interference using digital means, and of course here in Canada, that's a huge issue right now, digital inclusion, with a view to fostering collaborative approaches. And this year, under Japan's leadership, and we rotate the presidency every year, G7 leaders have really zeroed in on generative AI as an important area for action. And so under this Japanese presidency, leaders agreed to create the Hiroshima AI process in May of this year. And this really aims to develop a coordinated approach to AI governance. So the G7 digital ministers announced last month that we are working towards a set of international guiding principles applicable for all AI actors, a code of conduct for organizations developing advanced AI systems, and project-based cooperation in support of the development of responsible AI tools and best practices. And we intend to launch all of these documents by the end of the calendar year. So Canada has been active on tech governance at the G7 since 2018, which is the last time that Canada was president of the G7. And in that year, we created the Global Partnership on AI with France, which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. And we also established the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism, the RRM, to counter foreign threats to democracy, including online disinformation. And of course, Canada's leadership goes beyond the G7, in great part thanks to our strong civil society, our vibrant industry, and our always cutting-edge research community. As many of you will know, we recently chaired the Freedom Online Coalition, where we developed the Ottawa Agenda for Freedom Online, which outlines 12 priorities for the coalition's 30-plus members, such as taking renewed action to collectively condemn egregious situations that undermine human rights and fundamental freedoms online, and cooperating to prevent the misuse of surveillance technologies by working to ensure that digital technologies reinforce and do not undermine democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And I suspect Kyle might want to talk a little bit about that, and probably you too as well, Brenda. We also just launched the Global Declaration on Information Integrity Online with the Netherlands at the UN General Assembly just a few weeks ago. So against that backdrop, I want to just turn briefly to preparations for Canada's 2025 G7 presidency. And we'll take over the presidency at the beginning of the 2025 calendar year. So that's coming up really quickly. We know that digital policy is a very fast-moving space, and we also know that top-of-mind issues that are with us today may look quite different by the time we take over the presidency. So we're really looking to this panel and colleagues in this room and online to help us think through how Canada should use our G7 presidency in 2025 to address the most important issues of the day in this digital policy space. And I want to just go back to Tripti Sinha's presentation. I know I've been focusing on the G7, but of course, this goes well beyond the G7 economies. Tripti mentioned emerging economies and the huge number of people that are coming online. Obviously, as we look at digital policy, we need to be looking at this in a really global way and looking at the role of emerging economies and how the internet and the online and digital space is going to change from that perspective as well. So let me just close by saying thank you in advance to all of our panelists. I'm really looking forward to your insights as we think about how to shape the G7 presidency. Et je vous encourage à faire preuve d'ambition et d'innovation dans vos recommandations. Le moment est venu à façonner véritablement le paysage de l'économie numérique du Canada et du G7. Donc, merci beaucoup et je passe la parole à Paul.
Merci. Thanks, Cindy. And we're exactly on time. So I'm going to make two comments as we turn over to the panelists with the first question. And the first comment would be, the introduction from Cindy is fantastic. They're setting up, the context for G7 leadership for Canada, the role of civil society in that, and yet the G7 can't do it alone. But what I would note is, if you look back to 2 G7s ago when Canada hosted in 2010, feels like a long time ago, but it's actually not that long, right? Not only was it the G8, right, which included another, how much has changed, right, since 2010, but also in 2010, in the G7 leaders communique, there is not a single mention of the word digital or data, right? The presentation this morning mentioned exponentiality. We've seen this issue emerge with an exponential curve, right? Computational power, the generation of data, and now that's coming live in the social context and with AI and things. So a lot has changed, and it now makes sense that we're having this conversation. So that's point one. Point two is the diversity of views on this, because it is such a central policy issue. You've got everything from privacy to competitiveness to the future of technology in this. So there are a lot of views on this, and we're going to hear this from our panelists, where we've selected a group that represents at least some of the diversity of views, and there are more. And I think we're going to hear from a little bit more of a private sector perspective, a very human rights kind of lens, maybe is fair to say, as well as a broader public policy lens with some features. So we're going to get a bit of it. We're going to give them a chance to say what they think, and then as we go through the conversation, let's probe a little bit and don't be afraid to push them a little bit on some of the issues. So with that, let's move into the question. So the first question to all the panelists, and the ordering I have for this, by the way, and then we'll flip it when we go through, is Brenda, Kyle, and Phil, so that you've got a heads up of the ordering. Give you a few seconds here. The question is the G7's current approach to and structure for digital technology emphasizes the economic competitiveness angle. Do you think this reflects the whole breadth of digital technology? And if not, what other angles should the G7 consider? So this is a broad question to start off. Brenda, can we turn to you first?
It seems obvious to answer that question with a simple no, and I'm going to embrace predictability and do so. Digital technologies are transformative across all facets of our society: health, education, public safety, law and justice, immigration, migration, sustainability, and climate change or climate action. In every one of these, there are obviously, of course, economic factors at play, but focusing on the impacts of digital writ large through the narrow lens of economic opportunities provides a narrow view that's not just going to miss the risks that technologies bring to our rights and freedoms in the range of democratic nations that make up the G7, and of course, which is one of my own areas of research focus, but also it creates an overly narrow view of the opportunities that these technologies can provide, not just to make money, which is an important goal that improves public good for all of us, but more specifically and more broadly focused on what can these technologies do to genuinely impact the public good in ways that go beyond economic impact. And a really obvious example, a trivial example almost, but I'll use it to make the point of how simple this question really is. An economic perspective would mean telehealth care for people in Canada's far north. Might not happen because it's really expensive and really difficult to provide that connectivity across a long-lasting and profound digital divide. A public good perspective grounded in the rights of people and the responsibilities of governments would prioritize equalizing access to that kind of quality health care across the digital and across that urban-rural divide. And we do have a better framework, and it's already been mentioned this morning. It's the Ottawa Agenda, which takes a rights-first approach, which emphasizes multi-stakeholder collaborative models for digital policy. So I firmly believe the G7 should be providing global leadership with a more holistic approach to a true democratic understanding of the transformative potential of digital that can make life better for all of us and not just make us money, but enhance civic participation.
Thank you, Brenda. So we'll come back with questions to follow up, but let's go to Kyle next.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of parrot Brenda's comments and give a firm no. I think that, yes, the G7 are the world's 7 largest economies, but as Cindy also said, we're bound by values and interest. Our values, we're all democratic states. We have the rule of law. We're not perfect, but there's a reason why a lot of people want to move and migrate into G7 countries. We have something good that's going here. And I think on the digital side, we also can't be complacent either. I think it would be very useful for the G7 to have a bold agenda on digital technologies, particularly at how we're seeing human rights and democracies kind of erode around the planet right now. I mean, just today, Freedom House released the Freedom on the Net report that showed for the 13th consecutive year online freedoms are decreasing. And that's also in line with what people call democratic backsliding, what we're seeing across the world. So I think the G7 is well placed, and I would argue that Canada should actually push for an ambitious digital policy that goes beyond just the economic side. But yes, it's important that we have a thriving tech sector in Montreal, the AI community, in Kitchener-Waterloo. That's important. But there are wider societal elements at play from, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but the multitude, I would argue, of threats to democratic open states, disinformation, cyber operations, censorship, all of these are so complex, and we can't just work with them in silos. We have to take a holistic global approach to deal with this. And the G7, as a leading group of economies, also have the resources to put more resources to allow governments and civil society to play a larger role in what we're seeing is a global fight against what I'll talk about in the next session, digital authoritarianism.
Thank you, Kyle. Phil, let's move over to you now.
Sure.
Same question.
All right, I'm going to try and avoid just giving a no, but I do agree with what Brenda and Kyle have been saying, and I think focus on inclusion as part of economic growth and competitiveness is something I would expect to see at the G7, and certainly from the opening remarks that Cindy provided regarding the context for some of the discussions they're going to have around international principles for AI, the Hiroshima process. A lot of this will be based on prior G7 commitments, including the Global Partnership on AI and the OECD principles. And if you look at those frameworks, inclusion, diversity, and equitable distribution of the benefits of these technologies are priorities. So I understand the competitiveness framing, because there is also a sense that many of these issues, some being purely about building the market, some being about values, and many of them are being intertwined. As the G7 group, plus the EU, there's a sense that if we do not have a meeting of the minds on this quickly, we will have competitiveness issues that threaten not only economic prosperity, but our values as well. So I would see, this is one of the ways that I read it, with some of that broader context in mind, that the competitiveness is about the prosperity, but it is also about our way of life.
Thanks for that. So we'll move on to the moderated specific questions now. Cindy, thanks for staying with us up here. That's great. And we will ask a specific question. I'm going to go to Kyle, then Brenda, and then Phil. So Kyle, the question to you is, how can the G7 better address the threat posed by digital authoritarianism, which you hinted at earlier?
So first of all, for those in the crowd, digital authoritarianism is the use of emerging digital technologies for authoritarian purposes, and that's to suppress their own populations in authoritarian states, but also to export that into Western societies, open democracy. So to have that lynched at the G7 as mentioning what digital authoritarianism is and comprising of the four elements of disinformation or information campaigns, cyber operations, cyber attacks, surveillance, and so forth, outlining that would bring together four kind of policy areas that are now being worked kind of in silos. So I think that would be very, very important. And we also need to realize, Paul, you mentioned before the G7 was a G8, and now we're the G7. There's been amazing changes in society globally, and we're talking about the war in Ukraine here, which Russia is no longer part of the G8. But we've seen key institutions for the European Union, which is maybe the new G8 member of the G7. The day that the European Parliament announced sanctions against Russian officials for the illegal war in Ukraine, we saw enormous amounts of cyber attacks that shut down the EU Parliament. We've seen disinformation campaigns unimpeded about targeting specific G7 members, blaming, for example, the US for alleged bioweapons in Ukraine. Looking at democratic societies and how we had certain authoritarian states that weaponized disinformation over COVID that had a negative health impact in Canada and other places, now using those same techniques to sow doubt and polarization in our societies over the war in Ukraine. So this is happening full scale. We don't really know how to counter it in a unified manner, and I think we need a lot of deep thinking and more expertise coming together with the resources to really tackle these issues. And I would just also just say on the other side of that, we're talking about Russia, but the other elephant in the room is China. We've seen, and for my work on human rights, we've seen large Chinese tech firms, Huawei, Tencent, and others that have been engaged in surveillance of ethnic minorities in China, of which there's fears of genocide taking place against the Uyghurs. And those same companies are coming into open societies, G7 countries, getting massive research contracts at Canadian universities, bidding for contracts at the municipal level. And we kind of don't have our policies lined up. How can we allow these companies that are doing some of the most horrific human rights abuse in the world to come in and profit in our society? So I think we need to get a holistic picture. My colleagues, we've just put together a global task force to counter digital authoritarianism with experts, many from the G7 countries, to kind of work on this, come up with a plan. We want to create a digital authoritarian atlas to allow policymakers to see what companies are engaged in suppression, disinformation, you name it, where they're operating, and what we can do to counter this. But I think we need to be ambitious because this is a fundamental, I think the combination of these technologies with authoritarian actors are going to negatively impact our economy, our human rights, our security, and our values. And if we don't have those, the future looks bleak. So there's my calling card for Canada to really try to take a leadership on this. And I think all these other countries that are members of the G7 are facing these same problems, and we need a strategy and a collaborative way forward on this. And that's my wish list for the G7 going forward.
Thanks a lot, Kyle. One precision, if I may. You mentioned, I think you said 4 policy kind of clusters. Can you just say what they are again? Because your point was those need to be integrated.
Yeah.
Can you just
so
remind everyone,
specify,
what are the 4 you're talking about?
We have censorship and surveillance. And we see this taking place across countries. There's been fear of Huawei exporting technologies, Hikvision cameras. There's that aspect of surveillance and the end of privacy. We also have cyber operations, like cyber attacks that are taking place, including digital armies and bots online. That's another aspect of digital authoritarianism. We also have information operations or disinformation campaigns taking place. that's another one. And then there's a repressive side of this, of just attacks against individuals online, and that could sometimes also go into election interference, which we saw in the Canadian election, where we had a number of Conservative MPs that lost their seats because of that. So those are kind of the 4 elements, but they're all kind of worked on in separate silos, and we need to bring them together because they often intersect, but our expertise is treating them as 4 separate things. But the actors that are against G7 countries are not thinking that way.
Thanks, Kyle. That's important to emphasize that. So we'll go next to Brenda. And the question here, Brenda, is how should Canada develop its engagement with digital stakeholders, both domestic and international, ahead of the presidency in 2025?
Thank you. I think for all of the incredibly important reasons that Kyle just laid out, my pitch would be that Canada seriously needs to consider widening the scope of meaningful engagement across multiple stakeholder groups, beyond the actors who make or sell digital technologies to those who live with it. Give life to the multi-stakeholder model that our keynote speaker this morning told us has been so successful at ICANN. And I'm going to use the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act here in Canada as an example of why we need to do policy differently, why we need to widen the tent. The Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, or ADA, is rolled into Bill C-27, which also includes a long-awaited private sector privacy law. I'm currently at McMaster University teaching public policy. I'm on leave from my former role as the privacy director at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. It is literally my job to be aware of tech policy that is about to emerge in Canada, and ADA took me by surprise. I didn't know about it. It also came as a surprise to my colleagues in social sciences and academia, and I'm not a technician, I'm a social scientist, and my colleagues in civil society. And I'm not whining because I was left out. I cannot name a single civil society group in Canada who works in the areas of privacy, surveillance, technology, or data governance, who wasn't a bit shocked with the addition of ADA in C-27. One might speculate, casting back to our first question, that it's one of the results of an economic lens on artificial intelligence, that civil society and academia were largely left out of the framing conversations prior to the tabling of that bill. What was the result? Well, if you've been watching that particular file, there have been a bunch of valid criticisms of the process, even before we start to get to comments on the framing and the content of the bill. There has been some listening by government. Most recently, there have been some theoretical presumptive amendments suggested to committee that has correspondingly caused a terrible disruption and resulted in uncertainty as to when witnesses are going to be heard in that study. Because of course it will be very difficult to witness before a bill where there are already amendments in the mind of government. What's the end result of those kinds of political fights that only the most policy wonkish of us probably are really aware of? The end result is bad publicity. The end result is finally a diminishment of public trust in the technology and in the government that residents of Canada need to believe can enact the laws to allow us to use these truly, potentially beneficial, important technologies for public good in our society. So from both a social and an economic perspective, it's bad if the tent isn't big enough to include consultation with all of those whose lives are going to be affected and who have valuable contributions to make to a public conversation. And this is important because we know that Canada is lagging in adoption of technologies and lagging in the productivity gains that we can have if we were to do a better job of bringing these technologies into our businesses and our schools and our lives. So I think if Canada wants to make the best use of its presidency, it needs to widen the circle of conversation and meaningful consultation from creators and businesses to users, from industry to civil society, not just here at home, but internationally, because you're going to get a very different perspective on the way that data protection laws, the ways that cybersecurity legislation, the ways that any of the sort of pieces of law that affect the digital in different countries, you're going to get a very different perspective on that when you talk to a government than you are if you talk to the civil society actors who are on the ground living with the impacts of those laws. So groups like Liberty in the UK, groups like the ACLU in the US, groups like the Canadian Civil Liberties and many others here in Canada are important stakeholders to provide a more complete picture. And I think that can genuinely help Canada set strong strategic priorities and also understand what's needed to move the digital agenda forward in Canada and globally in a way that is coordinated, interoperable, and rights respecting.
Thank you, Brenda. Point is well taken on the importance of consultations, and I think one of the objectives for the government people that are here today is listening and moving in that direction for the G7 in 2025. Can I ask you a follow-up question, which would be that and by the way, I should say on ADA right now, that legislation is open for comment right now. I think you know that, but it just opened for written submissions this week. So if people are interested in writing in on that, they should do that now. But what would your advice be on how to improve that engagement? Pretty technical issues, right? Not everyone is chatting about these. They are in general ways, but they're not aware of the details. How do we do a better job as Canada to consult with Canadians? Could, for example, public policy schools be more proactive in that space, right? And kind of generating discussions and things. Would you add anything further on that point? Like, what could we do better concretely? Any idea?
I think that our academic community, our public policy schools, and our social scientists have a lot to contribute in this area. So I'm going to do a shout out to colleagues at the University of Toronto Law School, Lisa Austin, and the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, Andrea Slane, who are currently, and this is just one example, working on a SSHRT grant, and I'm helping them. I'm part of that as well. And we're trying to figure out how do you consult with members of the public on a technology. The technology we're focused on is facial recognition. That is very technical, very controversial, not really well known publicly, in a way that is meaningful, that doesn't bias people, that doesn't create sort of ingenuine consultation, but that can provide meaningful insights into the way that people across Canada think about technology and how they feel it is or is not appropriate to be integrated into their communities. So I think, broadly speaking, there are a lot of academics at McMaster that do the same kind of work in thinking through how do we create models of deliberation among people so that we can have better public consultations that produce more meaningful results that can truly help to guide policy. And that's another reason why that casting the net to that kind of research has not just a theoretical, but a profoundly practical value in helping to move things forward.
Thanks, Brenda. Okay, so we're doing well for time. I'm going to go to Phil here with the last of these specific questions. If Cindy wants it, who's carefully taking notes, I see. If she wants to say something, there'll be a window to do so. But Phil, to you, how can the Canadian government better represent the interests of the Canadian digital industry at the G7?
It's a good question. If I may, I'd like to try and provide a response to some of what Brenda was saying that I think ties into the answer to this question too, which is I think if we're looking at consultation around ADA or consultation as part of Canada's G7, I think we're touching on a tension that we've seen in discussions about digital policy for a very long time now, is that it's very hard to move quickly while speaking to everyone and collecting their input. And I think largely we failed across the board to do this, whether we're talking about online safety, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence. Privacy, I think I will go ahead and say, has been a little different because, there we've had discussions for a long period of time. But I think what we're identifying is a gap in the I'll call it the digital policy community or Canadian institutions that make it very difficult to consult with not only civil society and academia but industry. If I think back to I think there's a lot of policy proposals that come to mind for me when we talk about artificial intelligence and emerging digital policy issues that surfaced in the years, we're still talking about them, but in earlier years when we were grappling with issues on social media and online harms. A popular proposal that I think the Freedom Online Coalition and other multilateral efforts have tried to take up is something like a citizens coalition. But I'm talking about kind of a standing body that might be able to deal with these issues and discuss them and table them in a more organized fashion. So obviously this will require funding, maybe some shirk funding, but more than that, I'm sure. And I think a goal for this type of, let's call it a new institution for discussing digital policy, would be to do so in a way that is not, with an agenda that I think does not follow, strictly speaking, the political agenda, because you end up being behind and you end up trying to follow a moving target. We need to, and then I think I'll segue into discussing the G7 priorities, but a place where I've seen this conversation happen slowly over time and cover lots of different issues that are relevant to my own work in the AI industry is in international standards bodies that have been looking at new proposals for some aspect of AI governance for years already, way ahead of this coming onto a political agenda, and in many cases even ahead, leading G7 and multilateral discussions at the OECD or the G20. So there is a work program of policy issues that are very technical policy issues or technical issues that have policy impacts that have been that are on the work program of international standards bodies like ISO, like IEEE, like other novel institutions that have popped up to try and address these gaps, like the Responsible AI Institute. And I think there is an ability to plan enough ahead to have these discussions in civil society, so that if a political proposal comes out, people are better prepared. So actually, I haven't segued yet, have I? But I'll do that very quickly, and touching on some of the things that Cindy mentioned in her opening. I think, I have a little bit of a bias from being in the AI world for about 5 years or so, but from issues that Kyle's discussed, and we've worked on some of these together, and Brenda and I in other forums, I see AI cross-cutting against all these digital policy issues. Whether we're talking about content online, everything. And with the agenda for the G7 this fall, I think we're finally getting to some of the most pressing issues in digital policy related to AI and specifically generative AI. What should Canada do to involve the digital industry? I think the best ideas for incentivizing industry to be a part of this and coming up with meaningful proposals might be to take the government's code of conduct that people have recently signed on to, and to begin to fill in some of the, I won't say gaps, but you could use that word, some of the guidance on how to actually apply this in different contexts. Because that's really going to be where I think that the devil's in the details from an accountability standpoint, but also from industry's ability to use this document for anything. To give you an idea of what I mean by this, I work at a company called Armilla. We have a model evaluation platform that helps us, on behalf of companies, test and validate the AI products that they're developing or buying. and identify weaknesses in these products, and that includes generative AI. A lot of the large technology companies that are some of the most heavily invested in deploying generative AI are really struggling to do this safely and without additional guidance on how to test them, how they might be fine-tuned, what guardrails are appropriate, and how to do this for every one of those principles in the code of conduct. So, we will need to go about 10 layers deeper than this code of conduct for it to be meaningful, and I think Canada could play a role. Back to the project-based recommendations from the OECD and some of the ICID consultations on the code of conduct discuss this as well. What do projects look like that enable companies to pilot this code of conduct and for meaningful guidance to be derived from these, I'll call them pilots or sandboxes or calls for submissions, calls for proposals, whatever we might put out, and to bring this to the G7 as a potential model. So I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there because I just talked a lot.
Thanks, Phil. You said a lot, and we will be coming back to some of those issues. I won't ask you a subsequent question, but I will note that just to clarify what you're talking about, the voluntary code of conduct. So that's the generative AI voluntary code of conduct. And I think the intention has been that that would become part of legislation at some point, but it's, to your point, to move quickly and still talk, right? It can be a vehicle for that. So there's an interesting test there. Let's give a chance to Cindy if she wants to say anything. If not, we understand you're just listening, but if you wanted to say anything right now, you're welcome to do so if you wanted to make any comment.
The only thing I'll say is this is really valuable. I'm actually keen to give an opportunity to colleagues in the room, if that's part of the agenda.
That's where we're going right now.
To ask questions and just feed into this discussion, because I think, Kyle, and Phil and Brenda, you've made so many good points, and I do think it's a really good point that there is a real tension between the speed at which technology is evolving and the complexity of the issues that it's raising, and the conversations that need to happen, right? So I find your proposal very interesting. I think the devil is always in the details, as with the code of conduct, but I would really be interested in any of you or colleagues in the audience to talk about that tension between speed and kind of engagement and consultation, because I think this has been a critical challenge that the policymaking community and the political level has really struggled with, not just in Canada, but globally.
Thanks, Cindy. So that's exactly where we're going. We're on track for time. So I know that I saw one hand up already. We're going to go to the audience, and you can either specifically ask a question. Please do raise your hand, and the mic will come to you. I'm told to remind everyone of that, so wait for the mic. But ask a specific question to somebody or a general question as you like. And I think I saw the gentleman, yeah, maybe in the very back row there first, and then after that, please keep raising your hand.
Hi, Jacques Latour. I'm CTO at CIRA. Question. I don't hear anybody talking about digital trust. There's a lot about AI, this is happening right now, but there's a new, Europe is working on EIDAS, which is the Electronic Identification, Authentication, and Trust Services. So it's a framework for putting digital credential, trust registries, building trust inside the internet. There's a lot of work being done in Europe to have like 27 countries share electronic document together and build trust. In Canada, we're actually one of the leaders in developing technology around this, but there's no governance. So EIDAS is a governance layer for Europe to manage their digital trust innovation or plans. And we have zero in Canada. So I don't know there's a bunch of players doing stuff, but there's no governance around how we're going to implement this with the government, like federal government, the provincial government, the institution in Canada. We're doing work, it's ad hoc, and it's missing a layer that we need to put some governance around. So I think that Europe should, I'm pretty sure they have on their digital agenda, the digital trust, but it should be on ours as well.
Anyone want to give a quick response? Phil, and then Kyle.
I'll respond with kind of the best information I have on that, which is that there have been concerted efforts in the Canadian standardization community, specifically led by Standards Council of Canada, on digital credentials, and perhaps the gentleman in the audience is aware of those. I am not aware of how far that initiative has come, but it did receive a lot of attention and support, including funding, from as a result of a previous Canadian government initiative on data governance standardization, which at the time I was involved in co-chairing. So there was a digital credentials standard being developed. But I fully agree that we are missing that overarching strategy or coherence between a lot of these different disparate initiatives and their relevance to policy frameworks. So anyway, we can get into something else, but that's the one initiative that is, I think, would respond to that European effort is the digital credentials standard.
Thanks. Anything to add, Kyle or Brenda?
I'm not an expert on the digital trust, but I would just maybe frame it of trusting information online. And you see, how Twitter moved to remove blue checks from people who were journalists or politicians or academics, and anybody could buy it. And that trusting the information you get online now is much more difficult, because anybody, including foreign states, can set up fake accounts and gain a follower, and then just basically pollute the information environment. So I think the digital trust issue has to also be applied to the information space, or at least those that are engaging in disinformation online.
And could I just add a precision that it is the Digital ID and Authentication Council that has developed this standard for digital credentials with the support of Standards Council of Canada.
I just want to note one thing as well, that the G20 about 5 years ago launched the Data Free Flow with Trust. And that was discussed at the G7 this year with Japan as, is this something we should take forward? So there are frameworks around this, and I think this will be a question as to whether that's a place for the G7 to dig deeper. So I think the question is bang on, and it is on the table, as I understand it. So next question, please put up your hand and the mic will come to you, and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ross Hodis. I'm with Digital Moment. And my question is, the recent labor strikes that are happening across North America have as a major grievance digital transformation and AI. Auto workers in particular have progressively been displaced by technology since the 1970s. Platform and transport apps have also been able to circumvent labor laws. With the digital policy priorities at the G7, is there a renewed importance with regards to labor?
Any takers to kick that off on response? I would just say, from what I saw in the G7 and G20 meetings in the past, the ministers and leaders that are there, jobs is always kind of at the top of their list, right? And so when something comes up that might be a disruption to that, they are very focused on it, but it's seen as a two-sided coin right now, in that there's job creation potential and innovation, but they are very concerned about specific sectors, right, not being able to transition quickly or disruption. I don't know if anyone else wants to add, but it's always there. How to concretely grab onto that in the G7 context is not obvious.
Yeah, I think you framed that perfectly, Paul. I do think the whole link between AI, transformations in technology, including digital, and how they affect the future of work have just been really important areas of conversation, both at the ministerial and leader level. So again, I think you're hitting on a key theme, right? That is one that we need to think about as we go into our presidency, is where does this transformation of work fit into the agenda? But it's definitely been something that's preoccupied leaders.
And I would just add, it's not just the question of will there be jobs, or will there be different jobs? But the digital agenda affects the quality of work and the quality of work life for people. Everything from increasing workplace surveillance technologies and inadequate labor laws in our country and many of our G7 colleagues to address the implications of that sort of expanding potential for workplace surveillance, which has a very significant impact on the individuals who are subject to it. When we talk about online content moderation, to do it at scale requires AI, but to do it effectively with nuance, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, many in developing or emerging countries being paid almost nothing to be subjected to horrible images and troubling language to provide us with a safer set of online platforms. So issues around labor absolutely are important at the fundamental level of who gets jobs and who doesn't, but it's also really important in the digital context to think about what kind of jobs across the spectrum and what impact that's having on the lived realities of people who need to put food on their table.
Thanks, Brenda. I see there's a lot of other hands, so let's keep going and see how many we can get through. I think we're going to use all the time that we have. Please.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Noreen. I'm not affiliated with any organization. And for my question, I'm going to just zoom out a little bit of the AI discussion or specific policies. I'm just going to ask about, and perhaps my question would be maybe more relevant for Cindy, but of course anyone in the panel is welcome to also answer. I'm wondering about the digital development priorities for Canada during the G7 presidency. Again, the G7 is a very small group of countries. It does not represent the globally disconnected people. Currently, there are 2.6 billion people disconnected globally. And again, for digital efforts to be truly meaningful, we need to bring up these countries up to speed. So how does Canada plan to work or prioritize global digital development with initiatives such as the Global Digital Compact or any other global initiatives? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Would you like to open it to the panelists first, Cindy, or I don't know if you want to say anything, but any panelists want to weigh in on that, any aspects of that? Welcome to do so.
I'll just maybe add, I do think there is a digital divide, and we're seeing countries in the global south, sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing people being able to leapfrog with new technologies, getting access to the internet, but there's a lot of work to go ahead on that. And I think there's ways of maybe supporting key international actors, including some of the UN agencies that are starting to develop innovative spaces and look at the internet as a framework for development. So I think that needs to be done. There's also another side to it as well, though you're talking about people who don't have access to information or these technologies. We also have multiple cases now where entire countries are having their internet shut down in order to hide information. So we've had Ethiopia. We've had a civil war in parts of Ethiopia for the last couple of years. We've had that entire area shut down. We've had Myanmar has blocked and shut down the internet multiple times. We've had certain authoritarian regimes that have shut down certain apps in countries. So it's giving people access is one aspect of it, but we're also seeing a regression where these things are cut off to millions of people in a moment's notice. So I think we have to have a kind of look at it in both angles.
Thanks. Did you want to add anything? Or
no, I'd just say again, it's a great point, and I mentioned it really briefly in my remarks, building on our keynote speaker's comments, that you're absolutely right. There is this very significant digital divide, and you're right as well that the G7 isn't alone or by any means, the only network of countries out there thinking about these issues. So I think the digital divide is clearly something we need to think about. And I think the question really is what's on the G7's agenda versus what's on the agenda of UN bodies or the G20 or a whole host of other entities that are thinking through these issues. But a very good point.
Yeah, we're going on to the next question here, please. Thank you.
Thanks for the great panel so far. Have you seen how fast AI is moving? And I guess, so my 2025 could be light years away in terms of technological development. Companies like OpenAI and DeepMind are openly aiming to build human levels of AI, and if we get unlucky and it turns out to be easier to build than we think, by the time Canada owns the G720, the host of the G7, we could be at a level of AI that is truly transformative, economics, social, jobs. So on one hand, like obviously AI should be a policy priority, but I guess my question for the panel is, if we are in the midst of a full-blown AI crisis, what can the G7 do? I mean, AI is a global issue. It's going to require, ideally, all countries in the world to have a say. What is, in your mind, the relative strengths and weaknesses of G7 to be able to deal with such a global issue?
Any takers?
I'll start maybe. I think it's a great question. I think all the advances this year, a lot of us were surprised by Ada. I think even more people were surprised by the capabilities of some of the systems that we've seen in the last 8 months. And if anything, if that is any indication of what's to come, I think we're all going to be equally unprepared unless we do something different that hasn't been done yet. So I think it's a great point that Wyatt raises. And if I think about what I know about the G7, or at least what I think I know, I think it may be difficult for this group to come up with something that is going to be possible to contain the capabilities of systems that we are unable to imagine, at least today, that may be here in a year. Something that could be done in parallel with progress on the agenda and the work, the code of conduct and some principles, is for these countries to look at their domestic commitments to research in AI safety and to better coordination around funding of AI safety research. There's a huge there's a part of the discussion on this topic has been that investments in AI capabilities has vastly outstripped commitments to AI safety research and technical innovations to help implement those things like measuring capabilities of these systems and hopefully also mitigating them. So I think that the topic of AI safety and AI safety research is something that the G7 can take on. I'm not sure that will solve the problem, as Wyatt has kind of alluded to. Another topic that could be raised for discussion, probably during Canada's presidency, could be around the subject of licensing. Or there's been some proposals in the United States for what a licensing regime could look like for so-called frontier models. That type of regime would only be successful if it was global, if there was mutual recognition with other countries. I think the G7 is a good place to kick off that conversation.
Thank you. So the broader point that's come up in several questions and comments is the G7 is not big enough to do everything globally, but it is big enough to actually lead conversations that connect globally, right? And there aren't many groupings that are capable of doing that. So I think the G7 does have an opportunity. If something changes technology-wise with these frontier AI models, I think the G7 will be at the center of that action to try to bridge to a global conversation there. So
maybe the other thing I would add too is if you look at the membership of the G7, you have the United States, obviously a critical player on all of these technologies. You have the European Union. You have quite different perspectives on how you go about addressing AI through whether regulation or otherwise. And so, given the membership, that's actually a place where some of these conversations need to happen. And so I think you're absolutely right, Paul, with how you framed it. Some key conversations can happen there, but the G7 alone obviously can't address all of the issues that we've talked about today.
And maybe it'll come up again, the G20 role here on the bridge there, whether that comes up or not, let's see. But there are a couple of other hands. Anyone else have a question, please?
Yeah. Fenwick McKelvey, Concordia University. I'm old enough, I was at the last 2018 G7 kickoff, And I was struck, as just as a comment, and to kind of echo, I think, some of Brenda's comments, there was this great speech, and one of the presenters was talking about explaining this problem of explaining artificial intelligence to the public. And it was describing Yoshio Bengio giving a fantastic talk about artificial intelligence. And then they turned, very technical talk, and they turned to the audience, and all the questions were about the Terminator. And I think that this is something which really speaks to a gap we've known for years, that public understandings of these systems far outpace what's going on, and part of the legitimation process, which is whether it's ADA or any of the kind of, or the statement of generative AI, is not simply about, consensus. It's also about building public capacity and literacy. And really that's partially, I'd say, is a kind of lesson, is that as much as we've invested, and this is something, it's a criticism of the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, the investment has been largely around industrial policy, and that public literacy has outpaced it. And Canada has, in global rankings, fairly low trust in AI systems among a number of studies at this point. So I think there is kind of a sense about this is not an issue that is urgent in terms of that trust, especially just because I think the salience of kind of AI doomerism is part of the issue at hand here. So I guess my question is in this defense, and I thought it was really quite striking, this defense of what the G7 is, and as liberal democracies with a shared consensus, part of what it sounds like is there's been push, at least in the technical community, to talk about safety. We have ADA talking about harms, and is there a vision for Canada's leadership to try to articulate human rights, or what the future of a human rights agenda for G7 countries might be on a tech file?
Well, I'm pretty sure there's a comment or two there on the panel on that one. Who wants to kick off?
I just reflecting on what Fenwick said. I'm glad we didn't go into discussion on killer robots, because we could have done that. But I do think that the public's understanding of AI generally is quite limited. I was quite interested yesterday. I opened up the weekend edition of New York Times, and there was an entire ad on deepfake technology about a school in Switzerland put out an ad to basically asking for certain measures to be done for deepfakes, which is synthetic media, and the human rights impact of that. So it's interesting to see certain things kind of pop up where you're seeing public displays kind of change and focus on not just the killer robot Terminator element, but other aspects of the misuse of this tech. So that's interesting. I would be very interesting, just looking in the future, if we do have a future where there is another President Trump leading the U.S. in 2025, what does that mean for human rights and tech across the sector? That's perhaps something that Canada is going to need to think about as it tries to lead the G7. What are the internal U.S. dynamics going to mean for human rights discussion in the G7 and also the tech file?
Thank you. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Let's try to squeeze in a couple of last questions if we have them, please.
Oui, bonjour. Mon nom est Michel Lambert. Je suis membre d'une entreprise qui s'appelle Equality et aussi membre du comité organisateur du Forum pour la gouvernance d'Internet. J'aurais un commentaire et une question. Le commentaire, c'est j'entends beaucoup parler de cette code d'éthique sur AI et ça semble être sur toutes les lèvres. Tout le monde parle de ça. On est tous un peu excités. Moi, je ne le suis pas du tout. J'ai l'impression qu'on va accoucher d'une petite décoration gentille. On vit dans un monde capitaliste injuste et je vois assez mal comment ce code d'éthique-là qu'on nous promet va changer vraiment quoi que ce soit dans le développement de la technologie. J'aurais besoin que quelqu'un, plus tard, peut-être pas maintenant, prenne du temps pour m'expliquer à quel point c'est utile. Je pense qu'on perd beaucoup de temps là-dessus. Deuxième question, plutôt la question. Il y a à peu près 2 ans, un groupe d'organisations de Montréal faisait la promotion de la venue ici à Montréal, au Canada, du IGF 2024. Pour toutes sortes de raisons, le gouvernement canadien n'a pas retenu cette possibilité-là. Et au moment où on se parle, sauf erreur, il n'y a personne d'autre qui a levé la main pour dire on devrait le prendre. Le Canada est maintenant dans un combat avec des grandes entreprises internationales, Facebook, Google, pour ne pas les nommer, et il est tout seul. Il est tout seul. Tout le monde, la ministre prétend que l'univers nous regarde, mais dans les faits, je ne sais pas qui regarde qui, mais pour l'instant, on est seul et on ne semble pas être en mesure de gagner. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas dans le G7, ou peut-être même encore dans l'idée de IGF 24 à Montréal, une possibilité de se faire des amis? Parce que pour gagner une guerre, des fois, ça prend des alliances. Et là, tout seul, on ne gagnera pas. Voilà.
Merci pour la question. Moi, j'ignore les détails de IGF 2024, donc je ne sais pas si les autres sont au courant. Peut-être pendant la pause, on peut en discuter plus. Is there another question? We're going to try to talk about that one and maybe in the corridor afterwards. Mais merci pour la question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hussain Badran from the Internet Society. It's really a fantastic panel. Thank you for the really excellent arguments. My observation and question aligns with what Kyle mentioned in the opening statements. It has to do with international standards that relate to telecommunications, particularly to the internet infrastructure. And that's a scope where the ITUT, the specialized agency of the UN that deals with the standardization and radio and development. And in that forum in particular, there has been very strong push from regimes that are well known to push for a new architecture of global internet that really not only serves as a market penetration entry for these countries, but also to fight for a new governance model of the internet and the critical internet resources. From that point of view, and we have seen this push very persistent since 2017, with the new architecture being proposed in 2019 called New IP. It's a completely new stack, non-interoperable with existing infrastructure, and will come with a completely new governance model where surveillance is embedded by default. Nothing has to be turned on by any government agency. It's embedded by default. I think it's critical to have this discussion. I believe it has been before, but also continue to have this discussion at G7, specifically because the countries on the table are like-minded in that particular point, and their collective arguments can strengthen the discussions and decision taken at these international standardization forum. In particular, WTSA 24, the World Telecom Standardization Assembly, the highest authority of the ITUT, is meeting again in India in October 24. So having a strong presence there with very clear positions against these kinds of new architectures that will fragment the internet and introduce surveillance by default as just a byproduct is very critical. And generating alliances around the G7 from other countries is also quite important. The final point I would like to make is it will be very helpful for the Canadian government and like-minded governments in the G7 to strengthen and lobby and advocate to strengthening the role of the private sector and civil society and academia in developing international standards, particularly related to telecommunications. We have seen over the last 2 decades this role winding down, and it's only governments who are present in these fora. And the knowledge, no offense, knowledge exists more strongly with the private sector, with academia, with civil society. So having these part of the decision-making process and developing educated positions within these fora is very important. That's where the private sector, civil society, and academia can really lend a hand.
Thanks very much. Thanks for those comments. So we're down to the last couple of minutes. So what we're going to do, unfortunately, is stop the questions here, but we're going to give the panelists one last chance for a minute response. If you want to include anything that was just said on the last 2 questions, feel free. And the ordering will be Phil, Kyle, and Brenda. The question is, what are the top digital priorities the G7 should focus on during the Canadian presidency? You can mention one. You probably don't have much more time than that. So Phil first.
I'll be very quick, and I hope I also touch on an answer that may be, at least 15% satisfactory to the gentleman in the back. But I think the G7 should come up with a work program for projects that help industry understand how to implement this code of conduct. Only at that point will we know how to properly incorporate this into any type of regulation. Thank you. Kyle.
I would just go back and say, I think on the digital terrorism issue, it's a real threat to democracies and to our economies. The G7 has resources to make an issue on this, particularly maybe focusing in, I think the issue of the disinformation aspect, that the open use of digital platforms by authoritarian states is now impacting our domestic stability, our domestic politics, and we're seeing a rise in polarization. From COVID to Ukraine to you name it. this, I think, is fundamental that we do something in this space. I know Canada's led on the information integrity file with Netherlands, but I think we could elevate that and really try to work with the private sector to deal with all the bad actors that are in the disinfo business.
Thanks. Brenda?
I'm going to go back to Fen's question and say what we really need. Canada, the G7 can play a leadership role in finding a shared way forward for rights respecting digital, whether that's AI development with interoperable regulatory frameworks, or whether that's appropriately strong data protections that really lie at the heart of facilitating AI, as Canada realizes very well in linking their private sector privacy bill with AI law, but also lies at the root of people's ability to trust in these technologies. So much of that distrust is from feeling like their data, which is a representation of themselves in the digital world, is at risk. So Canada's leadership in making sure that that connection between data flows and rights respecting digital technology is respected, I think is fundamental to moving forward on that file.
Thanks very much. So I will just say, as we're down to 18 seconds here, thank you to Cindy for engaging on this early as the thinking starts to gel about Canada's G7 year, to all three panelists for very thoughtful comments and interactions, and it was great to see the audience so engaged. I know many of you are working in this space. Thanks to the organizers, and I am now told that I should tell you that you have a short break, but that you need to be back here at 11:05 for the next keynote address. So thanks again to the panelists here today.